Good afternoon. Welcome to the show. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Canadians have had to face their beloved country's harsh reality in recent months. Many talk of the historical mistakes that were made, but the path that Canada has taken with Indigenous people was hardly an accident. In fact, it was all part of a very calculated playbook. We can call it the Colonial Playbook. And it's not history. It's still happening today, as we all know. Most of our audience knows this full well. It was the topic of the season premiere of APTN Investigates. Part 1 of this aired last week. Part 2 is airing this Friday. Today, we are putting that Colonial Playbook in focus. Our phone lines are open. You can call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. To add your thoughts to this conversation, I want to start by taking a look at this Colonial Playbook, which aired on Friday. It lives on YouTube. You can watch it in case you missed it. You can find it there. Let's take a look.
We want to begin with a warning tonight. Some information may stir up or trigger unpleasant feelings or thoughts.
The remains of 215 children.
It was devastating to know that there's 215.
The work around residential schools is the root of so many of the other systemic issues that Indigenous people face today.
You don't just, oops, I created a genocidal machine known as residential schools. There's a lot of thought, planning, processes.
That's colonialism.
Taking away resources, taking away opportunities, taking away families.
We are not fighting Indigenous kids in court.
And yet that next week, we were going to federal court to defend children against the government of Canada.
This is exactly according to the Colonial Playbook. We now know their plays.
Hey, everyone get close to us, back away!
How do we respond now?
It is often said that truth must come before reconciliation, and less than 6 months ago on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, Canada was delivered a difficult dose of truth.
The remains of 215 children were found at a former residential school in British Columbia. The Sioux Valley Dakota Nation in Manitoba.
And quickly, the numbers of lost ancestors on former residential school grounds continued to be counted.
At least 750 unmarked graves have been found at the Cowsis Residential School in Saskatchewan.
These unmarked graves were not discoveries, however. They were confirmations. Confirmations for what survivors had already known for decades.
The Canadian government has also known about abandoned residential school graves for generations. As early as 1914, the government was warned about abandoned cemeteries containing children from residential schools. One in Battleford was said to contain the bodies of 70 to 80, mostly former students.
So, here we are, the Mohawk Institute, Canada's first established residential school. My great aunt and uncles went here. They all suffered abuse here. And I'm here to remember, and there's a whole new generation of people remembering and reminding. But it begs the question, how could Canada forget this?
Joining us now is APTN Investigates producer Robert Ballantyne. Robert, first of all, welcome to APTN. It's great to have you on board. You joined us here this summer. Tell us a little bit about your background before we get into the Colonial Playbook.
Formerly at the CBC for many, many years, worked at the Toronto Star, newspaper, radio, television, that kind of thing. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Melissa, for inviting me on your show and talking about colonialism. It's a big topic.
No kidding. I was excited for this season premiere of Investigates as somebody who was at APTN Investigates for a long time. It's very close to my heart, so I was super excited, and this episode did not disappoint. And as I said at the beginning of the show, it lives on YouTube. You can go to the APTN Investigates page. You can watch the Colonial Playbook there. But do that after we're having this conversation here. So I want to ask, what gave you the whole notion that there is this playbook that Canada's been going through, kind of flipping through since the settlers started arriving right up until today?
Well, I think it's sort of a set of instructions that are encoded, right? I mean, if you really want to go really, really back, you can go to the Royal Proclamation in the 1700s, or you can even just look at the modern Indian Act as kind of the playbook, right? And we have kind of these kind of encoded sets of rules about, you know, laws and regulations and how we're treated sometimes by others. And I just wanted to, like you said, I think we're all kind of aware as Indigenous people that there's colonialism and it's real and it's everywhere. But I hope this show kind of brought a lot of different ideas together, and particularly the residential school experience and how that connects to that, and how we should be looking at a bigger picture when we start thinking about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the perfect time for that discussion, you know, on the heels of the graves being found. The entire country sort of went and looked like, what's going on? What's this all about? So I love the timing of this. While people are still interested, you come up with this, and I hope as many or more non-Indigenous people watch this to get an understanding of what their country's done and what their country's continuing to do. What was the feedback that you were receiving when you started looking for people to interview for this piece?
I think they were all really excited, actually. They were all saying it's about time, and really wanting to put all the pieces together. And I think, you know, we interviewed a really long string of Indigenous intellectuals and professors, and that, just seeing those people together, to me was an incredible thrill to have those minds kind of share the deep thoughts that they had, but in a way I hope was accessible. You know, sometimes academic thought can be really, you know, tough to digest.
Yes.
But I was hoping that, yeah, and so the big ideas. But
certainly, I feel like that listening to academics a lot. I feel like this is, I don't know what they're talking about. So I assume that other, you know, regular humanoids like myself sometimes feel that too. But this really didn't come off as that at all. Those bright minds shone through, and in very like relatable ways.
That's great. I mean, that was my dream, and I'm happy that the conversations are happening, right? And I hope that this is what that is for both sides. I think, you know, colonization isn't just an Indigenous experience. In these two episodes, we talk to Indigenous people, but I think, you know, everyone can see themselves in this colonial lens, and how we're kind of within this big structure that's maybe not working as well as it should.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Canadians generally feel that there were mistakes that were made. Let's see a clip from your show, Colonial Playbook. This is Minister Bennett talking to that effect.
Ahead of Canada Day, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Carolyn Bennett commented on the confirmations of unmarked graves, and she did what many Canadian officials have done in her place. She reflected.
Understanding that harm was done.
She apologized.
That we're sorry.
She made promises to make things better and made a symbolic gesture.
On Canada Day, I will be wearing an orange shirt. And I do think that lots of people feel that would be the appropriate thing to do.
And continue to uphold Canada.
As well as celebrating the best country in the world, but that made some very terrible mistakes.
But it wasn't a mistake. There was no mistake about it. It was intentional. It was deliberate and willful. So Minister Bennett is wrong on that.
These are not schools where people were sent to become university professors or to become mathematicians or to become engineers. It was never intended to create an equal footing for all people. And so it's not a mistake, it was a plan, and it was a very deliberate plan. And if we don't acknowledge that plan, then we can never move past it.
You know, what did you make of the idea that Canada's treatment of Indigenous people, whether through residential schools or broken treaties or the white paper, this from the lips of the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister herself, saying that these were mistakes, these were errors. What goes through your head when you hear that coming from somebody who's that high up in government?
I think it's kind of part of the playbook. It was handed down for her ancestors and the ancestors before, and that was kind of the point, is that it wasn't really to isolate Minister Bennett, although we did. You know, it's something that has been said by generations of people like herself. And, you know, legally, the difference between a mistake and intent is pretty strong, right? So I think some of that language of saying it's a mistake also kind of spreads the culpability around and not focus it on the government because they made a mistake, as opposed to, you know, enacting plans. And we have, you know, Dr. Ryerson's report. They knew what they were doing. We have the Indian Act as well, right? That's evidence that this is intentional. But the language of saying it's a mistake, you know, is a bit of spreading the blame.
You know, another thing that Canadians seem to think is that this is historic, that we should feel bad for what happened. Watch what Pam Palmater thinks of that.
Look at what happened in residential schools. They stole our children, put them into residential schools in the care of someone else, where they were abused, and many didn't make it out alive. What's happening in the current foster care crisis today? Stealing our children, putting them in the care of other people, where statistically we know they're far less likely to graduate from high school, they're far more likely to be sexually abused, physically abused, end up in youth corrections, end up living on the street, and more likely to be incarcerated as an adult or live in poverty. So there really isn't a policy that you can point to from the past that doesn't continue today, perhaps even under a different name.
Well, and it's not just continuing to take our children, as we know happens through the child welfare industry. Canada still controls Indigenous people with its police and their military response to resistance as well. Take a look. Here's another clip from the Colonial Playbook.
When we focus on residential schools, or we focus on any singular aspect of this process, it doesn't give the broader picture. When the recognition, like the offering of certain sort of gifts or trinkets or whatever, doesn't placate Indigenous peoples, it doesn't function in the way to pacify our resistance, you'll always see the hammer come down. And that's the Wet'suwet'en breach of the blockade by the cops, and the extraordinary force that they use is an example of that.
This is exactly according to the Colonial Playbook. We now know their plays. How do we respond now? And one of the things is not accepting what they've continually done over generations and hundreds of years.
You know, and what are some of the other, maybe less obvious ways that you found Canada uses to oppress and control?
Sorry with that question again, Melissa?
Sorry, I'm wondering what were some of the other, I mean, there's some obvious ways, you know, when we see DFO boats slamming into Mi'kmaq fishers who are exerting their right to harvest, when we see people, you know, blocking rail lines and being attacked by police for that sort of thing. These are the obvious ways that we see Canada oppressing and controlling. Are there some more insidious ways, lesser obvious ways?
Well, I think I think we experience subtle, you know, issues with racism, for example, right? There's kind of a lot of those kind of subtle issues, but I think it all is part of this master idea. I think in some ways is colonialism. To define it is really to replace, right, with our cultures, our territories, and if we don't assimilate, then force is used, right? It's to destroy. I think it's really subtle. I think the bigger picture is the subtle part of it, is understanding why it's being done, and we see the more direct ways, but sometimes we don't always think about the why.
I love that, and that is, I mean, you nailed it. That's the subtle way of victory, right? And the word is so. People think of it in such a positive way. If you're not Indigenous, well, like assimilation, it sounds like a good thing. And it's a curse word to others, right? You know, with Canadians seemingly now in a mood for truth, and then presumably for reconciliation. I think we're still not fully at the truth, but we're getting closer. And I feel like we're getting closer to them wanting to reconcile too. Do you think that there's an opportunity for what's been previously ignored finally be out there and to be understood in kind of in short order? Like, I'm just, how fast do you think that this is going to start turning around, I guess is the question.
Well, it's interesting. There are a couple of points in there I wanted to talk about. One is the truth and reconciliation idea. And I think a lot of times people use that as a post to say, that was then, this is now. And I think sometimes the reconciliation language can be dangerous that way because it's about an ongoing relationship and an ongoing fix and something that's going to take a long, long time, many, many generations, right? And so we're in an era, I think, kind of in adolescence where we're figuring out what the problems are and we don't really know what the solutions are, but we have to try, we're trying to think of them, right? Yeah. Really quick. Yeah. And and I think in our lifetimes we're going to be in that space where we don't know what the answers are going to be and we're going to be finding new problems or be aware of problems that have been existing that we should take on.
Yeah. Well, I know I personally have complained, you know, in 2021, where we're at right now, I was complaining like this is where this country should have been in 2015, quite frankly, and you chose to not read that Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and so that's why you're surprised now in 21. And it was, you know, kind of a little maybe testy about that. But when you look at the bigger picture and how, like, that's just still such a blip in time from 2015 to 2021 is just, you know, the markers barely moved, the needles barely moved, right? So I keep trying to remind myself that, you know, it might not happen in short order or even in my lifetime, and these things do, as you said, they do take time. I want to go to, we did some polling this summer, or just hit the streets, regular folks in Winnipeg, to see if they understand the effects of colonialism, and if they think that Canada is doing enough to reconcile for it. Take a look.
I feel like they're not trying and they're just shoving things back under the carpet, like as they've been always doing. Like, I think having a day, you know, it's cool and all, but I find, like, you know, actually do something to fix the problems. Like, you're not doing anything with the day. Like,
you're talking about Indigenous Peoples Day.
Yeah, like, it's cool to have a day, but like, I'd rather them fix, like, the water situation, because that's been going on for so long, and, like, I know that they're not, like, trying to, like, dive deeper into more residential schools, because that's what I just, like, heard on the news.
Yeah, that, and there are so many other in-depth issues like the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that also has a day, but again, there isn't enough media coverage in general or anything talking about them, and that by itself is terrible, because as a non-Indigenous person, these are still women. I am a woman, and we see that they're going missing at such high rates than any other race. Canada has such a good cover on itself that we're the nicest country. We are the nicest people. We know what's right from what's wrong. But we have so many deep-rooted issues, but we cover ourselves with that blanket to protect our identity from that. So I definitely think that we put on a cover.
Smart ladies. But not everybody sees things like those two smart ladies did. There were plenty of people that we met, some people who wouldn't even speak to us, say, you know, I don't have any respect for Aboriginal people, Native people. No, I'm not going to comment to APTN. Here's one, his take on Canada's situation and whether he sees colonialism in his day-to-day life, that he sees that Canada has anything to atone for. No, here's Sid.
I moved to Winnipeg about a year ago, and I stayed here for 2 months probably. Then I moved to Portage La Prairie, and there's more Indigenous people there. So I don't know if I am not really sure what the lifestyle of those people is and how they manage. But in India, what we usually do is we save money. That's like the main thing for Indian people. What I've seen in Portage La Prairie, Indigenous people are mainly into drugs, and I work in a bar, and I also manage a beer vendor and a hotel. And the people there, most of them who come in the vendor, Indigenous people are the ones who are more aggressive per se and are usually high on drugs, some kind of drug. I had to call cops a lot of times for these people because they're really aggressive. So it's probably their upbringing, I guess, because they aren't into the environment of being self-reliant, maybe. Oh, I don't know if I'm putting it right. English is my third language.
So that is one of many, many people who sees the effects of colonialism on a daily basis, but hasn't made that connection that where it's coming from, what happened to get those people to where it is. Robert, does this playbook stay open and the pages keep turning as long as the majority of people see things like Sid does, view things like Sid does?
I think it's not reading the playbook, right? I think this unconscious kind of stuff that gets passed on from generation to generation, and even as an immigrant to Canada, right? There are a set of rules that get passed down. Sometimes they're very in print, and sometimes they're very subtle. So I think it was sad hearing that commentary, I have to say, and the lack of self-awareness to check. What comes out of a person's mouth about other people's behavior. Yeah. But that's the playbook, right? I think it's like you said, you found it, and that's what we face. Whether it's said out loud, sometimes it's what people think. Yeah, for sure. Okay, we have to take a break, but when we come back, Russ Diabo is going to join us. He spent his career studying this Colonial Playbook. He has lots to say on it. And I'm going to leave you with another clip from the Colonial Playbook, how Canadians ignored survivor testimony about graves at residential schools.
It does take this ground penetrating radar, I think, to communicate that truth to non-Indigenous people. And I'm happy that that's happening now. I just really wish that survivors had been believed when they first started to tell those stories about what happened, and that they knew where those graves were likely located.
But as this year of reckoning progresses, there are challenges in Supernant's field.
There is a real capacity issue, and not so much in terms of machines of ground penetrating radar or even people who might know how to run them. It's more so, this is a very specific application of ground penetrating radar. It was developed to look for infrastructure, not developed to look for unmarked graves. And there's only a small number of people who actually have used it for that purpose in Canada.
Supernant notes the increasing calls for criminal investigations to be done.
We've heard a lot of talk about crime scenes and criminal investigations, and I think that if communities want to pursue that, they should be supported to do so, but that it should not be done by the RCMP, and it should be done by perhaps an international independent body, because I don't think it's appropriate for the federal government to be investigating itself on this.
Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back. Let's go to social media now with our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko. Jesse, what are people saying about the Colonial Playbook and colonialism?
Hi, Melissa. We received some great comments online. We asked, do you think that Canada made mistakes in how it treated Indigenous peoples, or do you think there was a deliberate plan? Here's what some of our viewers had to say. Terry on Facebook said, it was a deliberate plan. The more I learn, the more I see it as an intent to eliminate Indigenous people and assimilate into white ways. A mistake is something that you do without knowing the intent or harm. This was no mistake. We knew exactly what they were doing. Jamie commented, intentional. CFS is the new residential school system. Challenge is the most Canadians don't understand the history, and the newer generations weren't there when it happened. There is a disconnect between reality and understanding. From Tim, I don't think current governments intend to colonize, but they haven't taken the measures needed to decolonize and address systemic racism, so the plan continues largely unchecked. Lastly, Ian commented, some deliberate plans born of racism, that racism led to neglect, which then created a host of unplanned but foreseeable damage. Thank you to everyone that shared their thoughts. If you're watching live online right now, join the discussion and I'll feature your comments later in the show. Here's a few other ways to share your opinion.
Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
I'm here with APTN Investigates producer Robert Ballantyne, the man behind the Colonial Playbook documentary that we've been discussing. Part 1 premiered on APTN Investigates last Friday, and Part 2, the Colonial Toolkit, it airs this Friday. Also joining us now is Russ Diabo, who knows very well about this playbook. It was designed to rob Indigenous sovereignty and keep First Nations under Canada's boots. Welcome, Russ. Thank you for joining us too. Russ, I'm going to start with you. You know, this has kind of been your life's work, sort of like a counter-terrorism, analyzing and dissecting and predicting Canada's next move. What did you think about this? We're seeing this all come together, all of the work that Robert did, and pulled it all into one nice cohesive package for Investigates. Russ, can you hear me? No. Okay, we'll figure out what's going on with Russ's audio. He can't hear us. I'll go back to you, Robert. You know, it's always been First Nations people having these conversations amongst themselves. What the colonizers have done, what they're doing next, how to try to stop it. There seems to be more alert to the truth of this country and interested in joining in the conversation and changing the dynamic. What do you think it's going to look like for it to actually change, for those pages of the playbook to stop turning?
I think, again, it's that awareness, right, of that there is kind of the colonialism idea is to replace or destroy, right? That's not a sustainable plan. And especially, I think the next era is about how do we share all this? Neither of us are going away.
Yeah, no,
right?
true.
I mean, the design for us to be assimilated or just go away is not working, and it will not work. And so how do we change this adversarial system into one that's let's work together, let's cooperate, and envisioning that, I think, is part of the toolkit episode, the second part that we're doing. But I think it's hopefully something we're all kind of starting to think about once we see the overall picture.
We still don't have Russ's audio working, unfortunately. I'm not sure what exactly is going on there. Let's go to another clip, though, from the Colonial Playbook. This one shocks me, and I've got many questions for you, Robert, about this one. The Government of Canada was warning itself long ago, like a century ago, about what was happening inside these residential schools. Take a watch.
Well, we know residential schools wasn't a mistake. You don't just, oops, I created a genocidal machine known as residential schools. There's a lot of thought, planning, and we know what the final solution was. It was to get rid of Indians. And how could you say that all of these kids dying is the final solution and not think that that was an intentional genocide? When their own lawyers were saying, you know what, you're coming dangerously close to a charge of manslaughter here. So everyone knew what was going on, including the RCMP, including the churches, and that's why such great efforts were taken to conceal it all.
There's a real rough pine box with a body bag inside the pine box.
And how old are you?
I think I was about 15. And my two helpers were probably 13, 14.
And how often were students here told by staff to bury bodies like that on the grounds?
It was certainly yearly.
You know, from 1907, when we see the government warning itself that they're at risk of being charged with manslaughter for what's being done to these kids in residential schools, and then we see, 50 years later, 60 years later, 70 years later, we're still hearing from students who were there at the time who were forced to dig graves for fellow students. So, I guess the notion that this should be investigated. Well, first of all, I thought it was shocking to hear that documentation was there in 1907. But tell us a little bit, Robert, about the push for a foreign body of some sort to step in and investigate Canada's residential school history and bring Canada to justice.
Well, yeah, I think, you're bringing up the idea of the mistake, right? And we see that in the history, labeling something as a mistake legally is really different, right? Manslaughter is like, I made a mistake, whereas like second or first degree is that you had a plan.
Right.
Right? And so you hear that language being used. And how is Canada going to investigate itself? In part 3 of the segment, we look at Cindy Blackstock, that addresses that, and we'll talk a bit about that later.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea of how do you uphold your own self to punishment?
Yeah.
And so Keisha Supernaut brought that idea up that Canada can't investigate itself here. It needs somebody independent to look at this and figure out what to do with it.
Yeah. Russ, can you hear me now?
I can.
Oh, excellent. Good. I was talking to you and talking to you and talking to you, and you couldn't hear me. I mean, I'm used to being ignored. I have an 11-year-old.
I wasn't ignoring you.
Well, I'm super glad that you could join us, Russ. It's always great to chat with you. This has kind of been your life's work, this counterterrorism and analyzing and dissecting Canada's next moves. You really is kind of like counterterrorism, what you do in a large respect. So I'm curious what your thoughts of when you'd watch this Colonial Playbook.
Well, I was glad to see it come on as a program to start an introduction into the issue. But there are bigger issues that, the residential school, mass burial sites and, the court actions against, child welfare and Jordan's principle, and that are part of a larger context of the colonial system and structure that's still in place.
Mm-hmm.
I listened to the Prime Minister's first press conference on September 28th that he did after the federal election, and he referred to Canada's harms and mistakes when he was talking about his reconciliation agenda. So he's using that term. It must be one of the talking points of the Trudeau government.
Yeah.
To refer to harms and mistakes, because he's not the only one using it.
No, we heard earlier in the show, Carolyn, Minister Bennett was saying, we should all feel bad about the mistakes of the past. And there's like a century and more of evidence that this was not a mistake. It was a plan. I mean, I guess we can get into semantics about we look back at what that plan was and call it a mistake now, but
I wouldn't say it's a mistake, because for the past 6 years, they've been systematically putting in place a new structure, replacing the Department of Indian Affairs with 2 new Indigenous departments.
Yep.
They've imposed 10 principles for Indigenous relationships without consultation. They've set up these bilateral mechanisms with the national Indigenous organizations to take a top-down approach to give the impression that there's co-development of policies and legislation, when really it's the federal government that's got control of the pen. And don't forget, the first thing that the Prime Minister did in 2016 of January, he put in Michael Warnick as the clerk of the Privy Council.
Right.
And so that was a clear signal to me that they were going to implement a plan to take their liberal promises and turn them into a federal plan that meets the objectives of the federal government, which they've been pursuing for decades, which is to limit and restrict Aboriginal and treaty rights. And, Michael Warnick was the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs for almost 10 years under Stephen Harper. And there's, I had done a whole opinion piece for APTN on what he did while he was working for Stephen Harper. So as soon as Trudeau named him as the top bureaucrat in Ottawa, I knew we were going to have problems. And now 6 years later, I can see what they've been doing.
It's interesting, too. I remember when they did split, what was it? It was Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada. I believe that was split into Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations. And when they did this, it was sold as the government of Canada doing a favor to First Nations by giving them these 2 better functioning departments. I mean,
actually, they pointed to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and said that was one of the recommendations. And it was one of the recommendations, but it was one of a number of recommendations of changes in policy that the federal government was supposed to pursue. But the Trudeau government basically cherry-picked what it wanted to fit with its goals.
Yeah.
It didn't look at the whole set of recommendations of the Royal Commission. So, I mean, that's the thing, right? They're picking and choosing the direction they want us to move in.
Well, I want to talk to you about, you've done a lot of work exposing this 50-year plan of the federal bureaucracy to implement the goals of the 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy through the current Trudeau government's rights recognition. I want you to tell us a little bit more about that and where people, it's a fascinating read. Where can people find this work? So explain it and then tell us where we can find it if people watching at home wanted to go and snoop around.
Well, of course, in 1969, Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's dad, proposed a series of measures to terminate rights of Indian peoples, basically to remove the legal distinctions between Indians and Canadians. They wanted to get rid of the Indian Act, amend the Constitution to remove any reference to Indians, get rid of reserves. They wanted to do that all within a 5-year plan. And I noticed on the documentary that there was a reference to a deputy minister's letter that talked about changing the tactics and breaking it down into components, the white paper proposals, because there was so much opposition to it. But there's another letter that exists from Jean Chrétien, who was Minister of Indian Affairs from 1971 to Pierre Trudeau, saying basically it was the 5-year time frame that people objected to the most. What he said is they're going to continue and they're going to do different methods at different places at different times to implement the 1969 White Paper objectives. So here we are 50-some plus years later, and if you look through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, they've been working to accomplish a lot of that. They've passed legislation to convert reserves into fee simple lands. They're trying to remove the tax exemption. They're changing the status of Indians or First Nations. Now they're using the term Indigenous peoples. So when they put in that new legislation, creating these 2 new departments, they're now delivering services to Indigenous individuals and Indigenous governing bodies. So you no longer hear the term bands and band councils and band members. They're now broadening the term to fit to their land claims and self-government agreements that they're trying to get everybody to sign final agreements under. So, they changed the language, but, the intent is the same.
I love that.
And so for 50 years, the bureaucracy's been doing this. And whether it's a conservative government or a liberal government.
It was just exactly what I was going to say. It doesn't matter which party's in there. The playbook is the same. They just seem to pick it up where the last one left off and tinker with it a little bit.
Well, they have what they call, they had an internal document that said the government needs to use special words and tactics, SWAT, in order to, convince the public that they're doing good things in the area of Indian policy or Indigenous policy. And so when you hear terms like harms and mistakes, that's what we would call the SWAT strategy, special words and tactics, because they're doing that to try as a public communications tool to make it seem they're being more progressive when they say one thing and actually do another. Like Trudeau was saying during the campaign that they're not taking children to court. When you've got Cindy Blackstock on there saying, well, they lied. They are taking kids to court.
Yeah. But we've had reporters in the court covering that. Yeah, it's baffling to me. One more thing I would say about the, going back to the Liberals and the Conservatives, I've always, kind of struggled to understand why we are so much, we enjoy more and put more faith and trust in Liberals because they tell us the things that we want to hear and then don't necessarily deliver. We find that somehow less offensive than the Conservatives who just ignore us and basically flip us off and say we're not interested in anything about you.
I think the Conservatives are more honest about what they will do and not do.
Yeah.
The Liberals try to tell you that they will do something and then they break their promises, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think we have to take another break. Russ, thank you so much for taking time to join us. And you can find Russ's work. You can go on mediacoop.ca. And find all of the work that he's done. It's fascinating, a fascinating read, whether you're Indigenous or you're, an ally, somebody looking to understand this whole colonial playbook better. You can get in there, start diving through some of the work that he's done. There's lots of good stuff in there. But before we take a break, I want to discuss part 2 of the Colonial Playbook. It's actually called the Colonial Toolkit. Before that, consider that Canada has spied on Indigenous people who don't fall into line, like as though they're traitors or they're terrorists. And this includes Cindy Blackstock, who is a First Nations child advocate from the First Nations Caring Society. You have to check this out. I love this part of the Colonial Toolkit there, Robert, on the first part of it.
Her main message was predictable. First Nations children are underfunded by the government. Well, that's predictable because it's true. There are numerous employees on government payroll who are being asked to comment on what I'm doing or to violate my privacy by going onto my personal Facebook pages.
Strelkova describes why she monitored Blackstock's personal Facebook page.
But why didn't you just ask Cindy Blackstock, can I have access to your page?
She's on a different team.
Okay, we're just going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to discuss the Colonial Toolkit, what we do to hopefully stop spinning these pages of the Colonial Playbook. Robert Ballantyne will still be with us. You stay with us too. Let's go to social media now with our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko, to hear what some of you are saying about today's show.
Thanks, Melissa. We have some more comments from our online viewers about Canada's Colonial Playbook. Let's take a look. From the APTN News Instagram account, JDMG host said, "The systems in place are not broken. They are functioning how white men designed them." Jessica said, "Definitely a deliberate plan. They wanted access to the land's resources." From Sarah, "It was definitely a plan, and it's a plan now with the government not doing anything for Indigenous." On our Facebook Live, Gus said, "Well planned out. Take away the land, isolate on camps reserves, take away the children." Rema commented about residential schools, saying, "The government, churches, RCMP, and Pope knew very well what they were doing. A crying shame that it took place." Christine said, "The truth has been hidden and covered up for so long. People are ignorant because they don't know the true history. It was a deliberate plan to erase Indigenous people, and the road to reconciliation is going to be a rough one." Lastly, from Ian, "I think many non-Indigenous people are somewhat aware that these are ongoing, but they also feel unsure how to move forward in a helpful way. In addition, I think it is one of many issues where there is some sort of recognition, but people get wrapped up in their busy lives and end up doing nothing at all." Great comments. Thank you, everyone who took the time to share with us. We're always reading your comments, so keep them coming. If you want to add your thoughts, here's how. Join our conversation now. Call toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. Send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
So we've been talking about the Colonial Playbook used by Canada over 100 years to punch down Indigenous people. Now, the Colonial Toolkit, how to get off this dysfunctional merry-go-round ride from hell. Here's a look at part 2 of Robert Ballantyne's work, airing right here on APTN after the news this Friday on APTN Investigates. Check it out.
In the first part of this series, we looked at the tactics from Canada's Colonial Playbook.
So everyone knew what was going on, including the RCMP, including the churches, and that's why such great efforts were taken to conceal it all.
It does take this ground-penetrating radar, I think, to communicate that truth to non-Indigenous people. I just really wish that survivors had been believed when they first started to tell those stories.
Yeah, I was watching television and I saw the Prime Minister.
We are not fighting Indigenous kids in court.
And yet that next week, we were going to federal court to defend children against the government of Canada. That shows us where we are in this whole colonialism debate, is that the government still feels it can stand up and really lie to Canadians and lie to itself.
And now we look at those who are countering the playbook.
This is actually the largest modern treaty in Ontario's history.
Parliament Hill, the Supreme Court of Canada, they all reside on Algonquin territory. All of them are illegal occupations.
This is where the Ryerson statue was. It wasn't just the removal of the statue like in a protest, but it was considered something very community-based.
How have we fought back? Because I think what we need to be talking about is that we're not victims, we have strength. And while we've been victimized, that doesn't mean that we're powerless. We're not just survivors, we're powerful, resilient people. That's what I want to talk about.
What does a world without colonialism look like? How do we even get there? Let's open up the Colonial Toolkit.
Looking good there, Robert. So tell us a little bit about what we can expect in this week's show and what tools are in the toolkit.
Tools that we've come up with, and this is very much a team project. You know, I appreciate the credit, but almost everyone from the Investigates team participated, and we have interesting reports from Chris Reed and Charlotte Morit-Jacobs and Josh Grummett. So they're presenting some of the ideas in the toolkit is, you know, you see the wall of letters there, negotiate or walk away, transforming anger, like, you know, I think particularly that chapter with Pam Palmater where we tour the Ryerson statue coming down, it's like, it's okay to be angry.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's some use for us to be angry. We organize and we find common ground of something that we want to take on. And you see the Ryerson statue, that was actually relatively an interesting place where there was anger, but there was also grief, there was healing, there was celebration, and that statue came down and transformed anger. I think that's the point there in that chapter. Yeah.
I have to ask you, this was going through my mind earlier in the show when I saw you outside that Mohawk school where your family members went to that school. Had you been there before?
I had once. It was a hard day. I got emotional there. Just, you know, when you're actually there, and, you know, my great aunt is alive as well, and it's yeah, I was actually really challenged by that, Melissa, putting myself out there like that. I was curious what your reaction might have been to that. You know, integrating my own story in that experience. You know, we all experience colonialism, but as a journalist, it's a tricky place sometimes to be part of a story.
Yeah, no, for sure. Anything? Tell us what's in store for the rest of this season's Investigates.
Well, it's kind of a secret. You find out as we unspool our investigations, but we're out in the field, we're across the country looking into stories that affect Indigenous people across Canada and trying to create that change, you know, attacking colonialism really. I think, you know, investigative reporting is one of the most powerful tools to make change in the world, and I hope that we do a little bit of that this season, and I know our team is working hard to do that.
Well, APTN is one of the only news outlets that has still an investigative news component to it. So, I mean, is it challenging for you guys to even just whittle down what you're going to cover? I mean, presumably what you actually get to cover, there's hundreds more that aren't getting covered.
Well, you know firsthand, being a part of the crew, it's yeah. I mean, it's almost like where do you start some days, right? It's every season we're thinking, where do you start? Because there's so much to tackle and so much injustice to take on. But I think that's also the joy, is that we get to do some of that work. And I think we found the right stories this season. And like I said, you kind of have to find out week after week where we're going.
Well, we can't wait. Marcy, thank you for joining us. Robert, we're all out of time for Chewing the Fat on the Colonial Playbook and the Toolkit. Thanks to Robert Ballantyne. We look forward to this entire new season of Investigates. Thanks to Russ Diabo. Always love your hot take on old problems. And thanks to the crew who makes this show happen, and to our audience. Of course, we love you, and thank you for tuning in. All of the InFocus episodes are available as a podcast. You can go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Be sure to check us out, catch up on any old shows. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great rest of the day.